Hello, and welcome to this episode of Adoption Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, Lori Holden. I'm an adoptive parent, and I'm joined today by Sarah Easterly, an adoptee, my other co-host and co-author, and Kelsey Vandervliet Renyard, my other co-host and co-author. And today we are talking in our adoption activism and advocacy series with the amazing Betsie Norris of Adoption Network Cleveland. Betsie has been in the space a long time as an adoptee and as an activist. She was instrumental in changing the laws in Ohio to allow adoptees, adult adoptees, to receive their original birth certificates. And that was a multi-decade fight that Betsie's going to tell us about. So Betsie, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
So as to start, how about you just tell us a bit about how you came to be in this space? You grew up as an adopted person, and then what happened?
So I was the type of kid that asked a lot of questions, and luckily my parents were good with that, but they didn't have any answers. I grew up with flaming red hair, and people used to ask me all the time where I got my red hair. Was I Irish? Um, and I when I was in my 20s in the 1980s, so pre-internet, I had thought my whole life up to that point of searching, but had no idea how to start or, if that was a good idea, if I'd be hurting other people. I never heard stories of birth parents, never heard stories of search and reunion. It really wasn't out in the media at that point in time. And I ran across The Adoption Triangle, which was one of the first books, I think at that point in time, maybe one of maybe two or three books on the market about search and reunion and records and openness and secrecy and adoption. And I was in a bookstore and it leapt off the shelf at me, and I just couldn't believe that somebody had written all this down. And I stayed up literally all night reading it. And it was so exciting because it opened up all kinds of stuff for me that had been very internal and just very, I hadn't even put words to in my mind, so to read somebody writing about all this and to read people's experiences and especially birth parent experiences, because I had really no understanding of, that side of the equation. And so that helped me dispel a lot of the myths that, I weren't sure if they were true or not, but it helped me to see more accurately how different folks felt. And so one thing led to another, and I started a search when I was 25 in 1985. And completed, it took me a year. Today, of course, it would take maybe a day, but completed it in 1986 and reached out to my birth mother after, lots of thought and preparation and trying to figure out the best way to do that. I called her on the phone because I wanted to be as discreet as possible, and I wanted to have that feedback and, know what happened. I didn't want to just send a letter out into oblivion. She answered the phone, and I carefully explained who I was with the words I'd planned out. And she said, "Oh my God, I've been praying for this call for 26 years." Which was not on all the, wasn't on my list of things I'd prepared for. So I was the one that was in shock. I was so worried about shocking her, and I was speechless. But she was very welcoming, started telling me about her mother, whose name was Betty, who had red hair, who was a nurse. I was working as a nurse at the time, and making connections, and then started telling me about my birth father, who turned out she married 18 months after I was born. So they have three kids that they've raised, two are identical twins, three boys. I was the only daughter, the only redhead. I formed a really good relationship with them. And I was really fortunate in that my adoptive parents and my birth parents were both very open to meeting each other and incorporating each other in our extended family. So, it's worked out amazingly well. But I was really left with a lot of energy thinking, no one should have to go through all that alone. It was obviously such a profound experience. I had friends and family that I was keeping up to date, but nobody that I really felt fully understood what I was going through. My birth mother had been from Philadelphia, so I traveled to Philadelphia on my search trips, timing them for when the Adoption Forum had meetings, and met Penny Partridge and some other folks, way back when. And so my dream became to start something in Cleveland to bring people together. But also it just really struck me as a social justice issue. In Ohio, the records were open to people adopted before 1964. So I fell into that category, but I didn't know that for many, many months of my search. But then they were shut down starting in 1964, and that just felt so wrong to me that um, you know, that people couldn't access that, and that, for the juxtaposition that some people could, and then, due to what seemed like a pretty arbitrary date that other people couldn't. And so never having been involved in legislation, I jumped in with both feet to see what I could do to get that changed. So the next thing you knew, I was the leader of the state coalition that had just come together maybe the year before, and we had a bill that group had gotten introduced in 1988, 1989, as I was starting Adoption Network. And it was, the opposition came out full force. The bill passed the House pretty easily. And then when it got in the Senate and looked like it might actually pass, Ohio Right to Life got involved, the National Council for Adoption got involved. So Bill Pierce, came to Ohio, and so that just, for me, that really fanned the flames of trying to get accurate information out, because all the things that they were saying were so bizarre. And gave it our best effort. That bill didn't pass, obviously. The next year, we found a sponsor who her legislative aide was adopted. And so she had a lot of energy for the issue. She carried a bill for us 3 years in a row. And actually, the first bills that we worked on would have had three aspects for each aspect of the triad. So it would have opened up the original birth certificate to the adopted parents before the child was 18, then to the adoptee directly once they turn 18, and close it to the adopted parents at that point. And then for birth parents, I can't remember if it was 18 or 21, but it would open the amended birth certificate to the birth parents upon request. And so we had several attempts toward that, and eventually Ohio came back. There was a whole task force on adoption, and it definitely put the issue on people's radar. And the task force came back with very conservative suggestions, recommendations, and they ended up passing a bill that opened up records prospectively, kind of. It flipped things around. So instead of records automatically being closed with a registry for a birth parent to open them, which we always called the reunion proof registry because it was the most crazy system you can imagine, but that's a whole other interview. But they stopped closing them unless the birth parent asked for them to be closed. And to my knowledge, no birth parent ever has. So post 96, the records for the most part are open. That's still a lot that we'd like to go back and try to get adjusted, because it's still not quite right, the post 96 records. But so we had bill after bill after bill. We've worked on a lot of other legislative issues as well. Adoption Network Cleveland has been involved in other legislation around ethical practice and equity in adoption law. And so through all that, working on finding somebody that would be a good sponsor, we had several stops and starts, several different attempts along the way. And then in 2013, the beginning of the year, really found an opening In the meantime, Ohio Right to Life had been our huge opposition. And in the meantime, we had also, on a parallel course, trying to find a sponsor, had been trying to find inroads to help educate Ohio Right to Life. So had some success on that front, and found kind of a dream team of sponsors in 2013. And that's the bill that finally passed.
Can I interrupt real quick and just ask,
Yeah.
what was the educating that you did with Ohio Right to Life?
A lot of the conversation was, all the adoptees that we're talking about are already born. This really isn't an abortion issue one way or another. There was one person who was a leader in Ohio Right to Life who I think felt very strongly about this issue and, kind of was able to put it on their agenda, even though I didn't see it as being primary to their agenda. Their leadership changed due to a lot of internal politics, and the person who was left in charge as an adoptive parent and understood, I think, our position a lot more. And so there was an opening there to help to educate Kate Livingston, who's a birth mother. She's now in Michigan, but she was her origins are in Ohio, and she had really taken on. She was a big part of our team, and she had really taken on, returning back to Ohio Right to Life repeatedly until the time was right for them to listen and hear it differently.
Thank you so much for filling that in. I was thinking also of the turnaway studies where a lot of times people conflate the
Yes.
decision between abortion and adoption, and we find out that that's not the case in 91% of.
Yeah. They talked a lot about if the records were opened, they originally thought that it would tarnish the reputation of adoption, that people couldn't trust the institution of adoption if the records had been, if they'd been in their mind assured that the records would be closed. And then the law was changed. And so I think a lot of it was educating them around, what options or lack of options birth parents had, and what birth parents by and large want, for them to see it differently. But yeah, I think they felt like, so I think the Turnaway studies, which I don't think had come out yet, or at least it wasn't on my radar at that point in time, but we showed a lot of statistics of what had happened in different states, because they thought when this was a hypothetical thing through all those years of the different bills, they felt like there would be less adoptions and more abortions if the records were available. Personally, I thought there would be no correlation either way. But as we looked at states that opened their records, and I'm not sure that it was because it was a direct correlation, but it did show that adoption numbers stayed strong. There weren't more abortions. I don't think that most women are running out and researching adoption record law before they make their decision, if they're thinking about placing, either way. But
Well, and we
um,
have no shortage of things that can tarnish the reputation of adoption. If they're
yeah,
interested,
so
I'm happy to talk to them. Betsie, what do you see looking ahead? What do you see as like the most pressing issues in adoption legislatively, pertaining to the law, pertaining to ethics? What do you see as the most pressing issues that we're dealing with today?
So we have a long list of issues that we'd like to address with the legislature, and they really fall into equitable and ethical practices. We've done a lot of work around keeping siblings together through foster care and into adoption, or at least the ability to be in touch with each other. We are working with the donor conceived community to look at donor identification in future donor situations. And we're also continuing to look at that 96 law. Like I said, I don't think it's really impacted anybody's ability to get their records. The law that we got passed in 2013 that was implemented in 2015 covered the records in Ohio from 1964 through 1996 and opened 400,000 records. So we're good pre-64, we're good, pre-96, but that post-96 thing is still not the way it should be. We've been looking into, Kelsey, as you're aware, adoption providers and ethical practices, and some providers that aren't licensed or aren't really shouldn't even be practicing, and what we can do about them. We'd like to promote, wouldn't it be great if we could just take money out of adoption altogether, right?
I agree.
Chipping away at things, there's a lot of things that
Yeah.
the system isn't ready to, just switch completely, but, how do we bring the human stories forward, to have people understand more?
Yeah, and I'm very pro like cutting off some important limbs of this field, that they're like the unlicensed intermediaries, that they're a huge problem in the rising cost of adoption. It's fee stacking. They're everybody's hands are in the pot, I guess, and then I think that makes the cost go up, and I think which causes adoption to be more transactional. And I think there's a lot of that going on. But yeah, cutting off some of those limbs, I think, would be a really good start to get some of this money out of adoption.
Yeah, until relatively recently, advertising was restricted. So advertising openly for a birth mother to place a child with a family was restricted only to agencies, not to families just being out there. And that changed, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe, or less than 10 years ago. And that opened up the floodgates to all kinds of disreputable happenings. So that's something we'd like to change back to be more similar to how it was originally.
Right. Yeah, I'm all for that as well. What is it like as an adoptee being an advocate in this space for as long as you have been? I know when I was leaving the adoption field, or trying to, as we know, it's not been totally successful yet. I remember you said to me how just contentious this space can be, and how that can weigh on you, and how that affected you at one time. Can you talk more about that, and how you've pushed through it?
I think being a leader in any cause, you can become a target from all sides, right? And so not only, there were periods of time where not only we were, fighting the fight with people that maybe politically opposed us, but, even within the adoption world, there's different feelings, which I got. So, very much some of the nuances, and I'm not saying they're not important, they're very important, but you also have to be realistic and make the choices that you think are going to work best for the vast majority of people. And so there was a bill, I don't remember even when it was, like maybe early 2000s. We, alongside the access to birth certificates, we were also trying to standardize who could get what non-identifying information. And as probably each of you know, crazy things happen in the legislature, and all kinds of crazy things get said, and I don't know, we thought we at least had that non-identifying information piece, which in some ways was like such a small thing compared to everything we were going for, but at least when everything else was falling apart, we felt like that was going to happen. And then that piece fell apart too. And I remember, I just like lost it. So it was really hard in a lot of hearings. There was a judge who said that the only birth parents he ever heard from were ones that were in prison and wanted somebody to send them cookies or somewhere to go when they were let out of prison. People were just saying crazy things, and it was so difficult. So I've got a much tougher skin, from doing this for many years. But you really have to just toughen up. I don't know how to answer the question of like how I did it. I just, I felt that strongly about it, that I kept coming back and built the resiliency that was necessary to stay at the table.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think, yeah, this can be a super dehumanizing space to be in
Yes.
from the outside world, but then in the inside community, I think it's not always the most supportive place. I think that finding your people and your group that is truly supportive is key, but also yeah, it can't be your only support. You have to like support yourself and get through it. Because it's, I don't know, it's not the most warm and fuzzy space. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
there's a lot of, you're dealing with the external politics,
Mm.
but there's a lot of internal politics to be dealt with as well. And so, finding, to the degree that I could, finding ways to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
And a
sure.
lot of traumatized people, a lot of
Yeah,
people who
Yes.
a
have
lot of hurt people.
trauma that's, yeah, really that hurts and comes up and flares up in different situations.
Yep.
Speaking of support, Betsy, I would love to hear you just talk about Adoption Network Cleveland. It's been 35 years. You just celebrated the 35th anniversary, I know, and I would love to just hear more about how that's grown and evolved over the 35 years.
Thanks. Well, when I first started Adoption Network Cleveland, I tell people now I was young and naive and energetic, and I hardly knew what a nonprofit organization was. But again, I was determined, and I felt that strongly about it, that I was going to teach myself what I needed to know. I worked in child mental health as an RN previous to starting Adoption Network, and wasn't looking to change careers. This was a volunteer thing I was doing. But as it took over my life, it was the right conversation at the right time. And again, this is pre-internet, so people were hungry to connect and to find resources. And so as it took over my life, I ended up phasing out of nursing and phasing into doing this full time. I was a volunteer for 7 years, the first 7 of those 35 years. But I think one of the things that Adoption Network has done really well is to listen. It's really, a lot of it is a listening project. What does our community need? And so and how can we meet those needs? So what's, current, and really looking at it from a holistic viewpoint of not just one aspect of the adoption constellation or another, really bringing people together to share in that conversation. We have some services that are separate, but I think, what people really like the most is opportunities to come and learn from each other and to hear stories that they might not otherwise hear about people that have lived, the other side of the equation type thing. We've worked a lot with the county around kids in foster care, who all too often age out of care and don't find a permanent family. And so they're, kind of legal orphans, if you will. They've terminated parental rights, they're growing up in foster care. So, finding new ways to help recruit families and bring people together around those kids' circles of support. It was a new concept about 20 years ago, and we had a big project with our county around, how do we find people that these kids might name? Maybe they're relatives, birth relatives, maybe they're somebody they know at school, or somebody in their church community, or somebody that lives down the street, or who would the child say that they'd like to have at the table if we ask them? And that was a novel idea at the time, which is kind of sad, but so really, making a child center, and instead of trying to recruit strangers to adopt this child, how do we look within their circles? And so I'm really proud of that work. We got a lot of kids permanent relationships that they wouldn't have otherwise had, really hundreds of kids through that project. So it's been a real journey. And there's people often ask what's next, and I feel like we're really responsive. So sometimes it's hard to plan out too far ahead, like what's next, because I think we're good at picking up opportunities or creating things when they're needed.
I'm in Denver, I'm not in Cleveland, but I'm so glad that I'm on your mailing list anyway. And I highly suggest that people get on your mailing list if they aren't already, because of all that, we get to benefit from all the listening you do and how you know what's coming up for people and then begin to respond to that and bring forward educate people who can educate on those topics. So I've just benefited from so many of the offerings that you've had, even though I'm not in Cleveland.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been interesting since the pandemic. By necessity, we took our programs, our peer support programs and educational programs online that we were doing in person for all those years previous. And now that we have a choice, do we want to do this online or in person? There's some things that we brought back in person, but a lot of things we've chosen to leave online because we really have a national audience and we don't want to stop serving all those folks. And so our general support meetings, that's kind of the cornerstone of the organization that we've been having all the full 35 years. We have people that sign up from all over the place, live in communities that don't have something like that.
I was one of your cheerleaders and celebrators in 2015 when that law changed in Ohio, thanks to your efforts. And as part of my tangential involvement that time, I remember a story, an adoptive parent story about your father.
Yeah.
Would you share his evolution as an adoptive parent who loves an adoptee?
Sure. So through the course of my search and reunion and the subsequent political involvement, my dad, who is an attorney, was always really, really supportive. And starting the organization, he helped to give advice and help me structure things. And I guess maybe 3 or 4 years into Adoption Network and several probably 3 or 4 years and 2 or 3 bills on that legislative issue, he pulled me aside at a conference that we were having and said that he had to share something with me. And he shared that he had been one of the authors of the bill that had closed the records in Ohio. And that's why they closed in 1964. So he was a new adoptive parent, and he was told by the adoption agency when they adopted my brother in 1957 that the records were closed, and that as a new adoptive parent, he was just learning the landscape and wasn't sure how this all went. And they assured him the records are closed. People, nobody will show up at your doorstep, all of that. And being the young, curious attorney that he was, he went down to vital statistics and on just the county level and requested my brother's birth certificate. And they handed him my brother's original and amended birth certificate, just paper clipped together over the counter, not even asking who he was. And so he was horrified. That wasn't what he was expecting. And he was very politically involved in our community. And so, he envisioned, not only that the birth parents could find his family, but maybe a reporter, you don't know what's going to happen if they're just open to the public like that. And so he was on the board of the adoption agency that my parents used, and got together some other adoptive fathers, and they wrote a bill to shut access. His thrust was to shut access to the general public and have it be restricted access through the state vital statistics instead of just over the counter at the county. Some of the parents in the group felt that the records should be closed to the parties. And that's why he didn't tell me right when I started Adoption Network. He was at this conference that we were having, and it made him go home and look through his records and see if the bill that he had worked on had anything to do with this, because he didn't really remember, exactly what year it was or exactly how that conversation had ended up if it closed the records to the adoptees. So he came back and testified for our bill, said, I authored this. I was wrong. I was short-sighted. I was brand new at all this. I was scared, a new adoptive parent. I didn't know what to think. And it went too far, and it's hurting people, and it should be changed. That was in the mid-90s. So it didn't change for another, 20 years. So he was not, sadly, he wasn't alive to see a change. Gene Strauss did a short documentary on it. If anybody's interested, it's called what's it called? an adoptee word, I think is what it's called. The Betsie Norris story. But he couldn't have been more supportive, and he and I were very close. So I understood where he was coming from. He was the kind of, I learned a lot of my activism from him. He was the kind of guy that if something needed to be done in the community, you don't just wait for somebody else to do it. You jump in and see what you can to make things better for people. And but yeah, it's kind of like a Greek tragedy of a child unwittingly trying to undo the sin of the parent, right?
I love that. I'm really moved. I feel like I'm about to cry just thinking about his growth and his character arc
Yeah.
as a human, and understanding. And that's something I'm personally kind of going through right now too with my dad. The release of our book has just opened him up in new ways. Right next to me, just in a precious place, is this beautiful letter that he just wrote to me. I think it's so wonderful when we're out doing activism for others, and then when you see the change and the shifts happening in your own personal
Yeah.
sphere, you kind of move past even expecting that, and then it's like, oh my gosh. And anyway, I'm just really touched by your story.
I think one of the reasons why that story about your father stuck with me so much is because of the know better, do better that adoptive parents can adopt in the cases like what Kelsey was saying with once we figure out that we've participated in something that is often unsavory, then what do? We do better, like your dad did. And then also, when you filled in some of the details for me today, I was thinking about how much your father embodied the qualities that I think are so important for adoptive parents and adoption advocates to have. And that would be curiosity, an openness to new information, transparency, honesty, and a humility, for your dad to come to you and say, I did this, now what? So I really loved all of that.
Thanks. I mean, he had come to the conclusion himself that he was on the wrong side of this, I think, way before he, we even had that conversation. So it wasn't like I needed to convince him of anything. But he had the foresight to record his testimony, on an audio cassette. It was that long ago. But when he came and testified, he recorded it, and then he gave me several cassette tapes because he knew this was going to take a long time. And so his voice is in that Jean Strauss film that I mentioned. She used pieces of his testimony in that. But yeah, to be able to come back and publicly say that he was wrong, and there were newspaper headlines about it, like it was very public. And he was fine with that. He wanted to do everything he could to make it right.
That's just absolutely amazing that he was able to face up to that and own it. I mean, like if we could all do that, really, what kind of a world would it be?
Yeah, he was a fantastic role model.
So I had a question for you about, what activists nurtured you, and now we know your dad. But what other activists were mentors for you?
So I have to admit, I came to this not knowing the landscape really at all, and I jumped in with both feet. So in the very beginning, I had never heard of the American Adoption Congress, which was active at the time. And our founding conference of Adoption Network Cleveland was a regional conference of American Adoption Congress. And somebody had asked me if I would work with her to put it on. She had volunteered like just as one person to do this whole conference. So she needed help. And it was very successful. We really, that was really what launched Adoption Network. So I started going to the national conferences of American Adoption Congress and met, all kinds of Ken Watson and Kate Burke and, Dirk Brown, a lot of people who aren't with us anymore. Betty Jean Lifton, prior generation of leaders on these issues. And that was so important to me. To meet, both the leaders and people who were really articulating these things, but also to meet activists from different states and get connected with people who, at that point in time were so Pam Hasagawa from New Jersey, we were on similar paths, beating our head against the wall, bill after bill that wasn't going through. And this is before any bill had passed. So when Tennessee finally passed, a very kind of convoluted, watered down bill, and then that ended up in court. And Fred Greenman, there's so many people that were important, getting these things passed. And then the ballot issue in Oregon passed. That, as other states started having some success, obviously that really helped. Ohio didn't want to be the first. So that was a big part of it.
Betsy, one of the things that I really love about you and your organization is kind of how it's you kind of embrace all sides, which is obviously something that we advocate for with our book, is how much more powerful everybody is together. And I've been working with you on an issue in Ohio for, I don't know, like a year and a half, maybe. And we've had collaboration from agencies, attorneys, and adoptive parents. And the adoptive parents that you have in your orbit in Ohio have been phenomenal and have stepped up to the plate. Even people that have, maybe gone about things initially the wrong way in the adoption process, they've come full circle and they've said, this wasn't, what I intended. This isn't how I intended to build my family, in this kind of unsavory way. What can we do to create change? And so I just really appreciate, it's not a question, I just really appreciate how you see that power and how it can be harnessed when we all work together. And I see a lot of adoptive parents in your network kind of using that privileged power to for equitable change and advocacy work. And so I really appreciate that.
Thanks. Well, I certainly don't do it alone, so we've brought together a lot of people, and that comes back to listening, that those are parents who maybe didn't start out their journey thinking this way at all, but both their parenting journey might have brought them to realize, like, okay, there's a lot more to all this, and listening to their child, and but also listening to others within the adoption network. We have a board member who joined our board without a lot of experience, and he jumped in before he really fully had, he jumped into the leadership role pretty new in his involvement with us. And he called me up maybe 6 months later, and he was like, I just had to ask you, are you guys against adoption, or like what? And we had a really long conversation about, the complexities, because so many people see it simplistically. I think if they haven't had the opportunity to hear more, by the end of the call, he's our brand new board chair now. I mean, he just, could embrace it completely. But his mother was adopted. He had a very old way of thinking about how things should be. And there's a lot of energy, having brought people together for this many years. There's a little hub of energy here in Cleveland. So we've impacted, I think, how the agencies practice, and, all kinds, there's reverberations of that, helping people understand.
That's great.
That question, I think, is one that just shows the black and white thinking, right? Like, yes, we all get it.
Yeah.
Are you an abolitionist, or are you pro-adoption? And
right.
Where's that? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the nuance.
There's nothing in between.
Yeah. On your blog post recently, you shared 10 tips for what was it? 10 tips, 10 lessons you've learned. And one of them was about nurturing new activists. And I was just wondering if you could share some words of wisdom for any activists who are watching, or future activists who are watching on any side of the constellation, and what you would say to them.
Well, like any issue, there's a lot of people who might care about the issue, but there's, only a small percentage of them are really going to jump in and do something about it. So I think through the course of this, being that important to me for that many years, I've always watched for people who have that passion and also can articulate their position and, have the energy to jump in. And we all have to start somewhere, right? And so, just identifying people and inviting people in and having spaces where they can learn. When we had our final bill that finally passed, we had a group of like 4 of us who, and there were a lot of other people involved, but there were 4 of us that were involved on a daily basis, trying to get the word out. And, the other 3, Kate Livingston was one. I met her at a hearing from a couple bills before that one, and she got up and testified, which was so interesting to me because I had arranged most of the testimony, trying to make sure that all the different aspects of the messages got out. I had coordinated a lot of the testimony, and she got up and testified, and I didn't know her, and she happened to be sitting in front of me, and I tapped her on the shoulder. She was amazing, and I tapped her on the shoulder and gave her my card and said, like, if you ever want a job, call me. She just was incredible. But, like, how can we bring people like that, into working together? It can be so powerful. And we, like, Adoption Network is a lobby day once a year. So it's a great opportunity for people who have never had any political involvement or have never talked to a legislator to be on a team of people that visit different legislative offices with training and with materials, to have those conversations. There's a lot of great starting places.
Does anyone have any closing thoughts? Sarah or Kelsey first, and then maybe we'll let Betsie have the last word.
I just love I love this time that we've had with you. I mean, you're a living legend, and it's just, you have so much wisdom and expertise, and you're inspiring for me as an activist, and I know so many others. And I just want to thank you because all of this work sometimes doesn't get appreciation. And I just want you to know how much we appreciate you, and I appreciate you, and know that for everything we see, there's millions of things we don't see that are happening. And so just thanks so much for your tireless advocacy.
Thank you.
All right, Betsie, anything else you'd like to share with us or close with?
I'd like to thank you and just say how much I respect your approach of making sure that the 3 of you, writing the book with the 3 of you, making sure that the 3 of you have equal voices in all of this. I think there's so much that we can learn from people on the different aspects of the adoption triad or adoption constellation. And I feel like the pendulum has shifted a little bit away from that. So I'm really glad that the 3 of you are helping to shift it back. Not that there's not room for people to have services separately, but secrecy and separating people have been so powerful in adoption history, and so bringing people together is a way to heal that, I think. So thank you for being a voice for that.
Thank you so much for that, Betsie, for and doing your part in this sphere too of the bringing together. We're so grateful for your time today. We're so grateful for all your work and insights and wisdom over the last several decades. And thank you so much for being here. Thanks to everybody who tuned in, and please share this with other people, and we'll see you on our next episode.